Say it in Arabic. She won't understand a word. The sentence slid across the rooftop like a glass of top-shelf bourbon, smooth, careless, expensive. A few men at the long walnut table chuckled under their breath, confident in the privacy of a language they assumed no one else in the room could touch. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind them, 60 stories up, glowing gold against the night sky, the Hudson River reflecting city lights like melted copper. Crystal glasses hovered midair. A server paused with a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet tilted just slightly. And at the center of it all sat Richard Caldwell, 42, tech billionaire, self-made, self-assured, a man who had turned a college startup into a company worth $9.8 billion in under a decade. He leaned back in his tailored navy suit, a silver watch catching the chandelier light, and repeated the insult in Arabic, slower this time, savoring it. To his investors from Dubai, it sounded like humor. To him, it felt like control. Naomi Brooks stood at his right shoulder, posture straight, expression neutral, her black apron pressed, her name tag small and nearly invisible against the fabric. She was 27, 5'6", steady hands, observant eyes. To most of the guests, she was background noise, part of the service, like the soft jazz humming from hidden speakers. Richard didn't look at her when he spoke. He didn't need to. In his mind, she was an extra in a scene he owned. He was closing a $600 million infrastructure deal tonight. He believed power was about leverage, about speaking freely in rooms where others felt small. He believed language was a weapon. Naomi poured the wine with measured precision, the deep red liquid swirling into crystal. She did not rush. She did not react. But she heard every syllable. She heard the word he used for ignorant. She heard the phrase that implied she was invisible. She had heard tones like that before in her life, in different accents, in different cities. For years in Dearborn, Michigan, studying international relations while working nights. Summers volunteering at a refugee center, translating Arabic for families who had crossed oceans with nothing but hope and paperwork. She had learned early that silence could be armor. Richard continued speaking in Arabic, joking about how convenient it was to discuss sensitive matters without worrying about the staff. One of the investors smiled politely, though something in his eyes flickered. The skyline shimmered. The air smelled faintly of truffle oil and expensive cologne. Naomi set the bottle down gently. She adjusted a place, setting by a fraction of an inch. Then she looked at Richard Caldwell for the first time that evening. Not up at him. At him. Calm. Composed. And when she finally spoke, her voice was even, clear, and unmistakably fluent. She answered in Arabic, her pronunciation precise, her tone respectful yet firm, translating his last sentence word for word, leaving nothing softened, nothing hidden. The jazz seemed to fade. A fork touched porcelain with a sharp, lonely click. One investor slowly lowered his glass. Richard's smile froze exactly where it was, as if the night air had turned to glass around him. For the first time since he walked into the room, the billionaire was no longer the only one who understood the language being spoken. Richard Caldwell did not blink, but the room felt like it did. His fingers remained loosely wrapped around the stem of his glass, yet the confidence that had filled his posture seconds earlier began to thin. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not sharpen her tone. She simply continued in fluent Arabic, clarifying each phrase he had spoken, translating his private amusement into clear, unmistakable meaning. The investors across the table shifted in their seats. One of them, an older man in a charcoal suit with a subtle gold cufflink shaped like a falcon, leaned back slowly, studying Richard with a new expression. It was no longer polite interest. It was evaluation. The skyline outside remained dazzling, but inside the air had changed. Power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Richard cleared his throat and let out a small laugh, the kind meant to smooth tension. He switched to English. He said it was only a joke. He said humor did not always translate well. But Naomi answered in Arabic again, calmly, explaining the cultural weight of the specific words he had chosen. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She educated. Her pronunciation was formal, measured, unmistakably trained. She referenced the root meaning of the insult, how it implied not only ignorance, but worthlessness. One of the investors lowered his glass completely now. Another adjusted his jacket and spoke quietly in Arabic, asking Naomi where she Had studied. She answered without hesitation. University courses in Michigan. Years volunteering with immigrant families. Independent study. Long nights with textbooks while working double shifts. She did not mention the scholarships she lost when her mother became ill. She did not mention the student loans. She simply gave facts. Richard attempted to regain control of the conversation, pivoting back to quarterly projections, projected growth percentages, expansion across the Gulf region. His voice grew firmer, faster, but the rhythm was gone. The invisible advantage he believed he had owned had dissolved. One of the investors asked him, in English this time, whether respect for local culture extended to the way he addressed service staff. The question was quiet. It carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Richard forced a smile again, but it no longer reached his eyes. Naomi stepped back slightly, returning to her role, hands folded neatly at her waist. She did not linger. She did not demand recognition. Yet her presence now filled the space differently. She was no longer background. She was context. The deal documents on the polished table suddenly looked less certain. $600 million rested on trust, partnership, perception. And perception had shifted. Richard finally looked directly at Naomi, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. There was calculation in his gaze, but also something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The falcon cufflinks caught the light again as the senior investor spoke once more, suggesting they pause discussions for the evening. Just to reconsider tone. Just to reassess alignment. It sounded diplomatic. It felt decisive. Naomi inclined her head politely and reached for the wine bottle again, her hands steady as ever. She poured evenly, without spill, without tremor. Around her, men worth billions reconsidered a partnership. And Richard Caldwell realized that language, the tool he believed gave him private power, had just rewritten the room in front of him. The meeting did not officially end, but it no longer moved forward. The investors requested a short recess, their voices controlled, their expressions unreadable, and one by one they stepped toward the far edge of the rooftop terrace where the city lights could not overhear them. Richard Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, jaw set, shoulders squared, as if posture alone could reverse momentum. The contract folder lay open in front of him, its embossed logo, reflecting the chandelier light like a promise that had suddenly become conditional. Naomi stood near the service station, hands resting lightly against the edge of the polished counter, her breathing steady, her face composed. She did not watch the investors. She did not watch Richard. She focused on alignment, adjusting a silver fork by a fraction of an inch, straightening a linen napkin so its crease fell perfectly parallel to the table's edge. Control, she had learned, often began in the smallest movements. Richard finally rose and approached her, not with the booming confidence he had displayed earlier, but with measured steps, careful, deliberate. Up close, the difference in height was noticeable, yet the imbalance of authority was no longer clear. He lowered his voice, asking where she had learned to speak Arabic like that. Naomi answered in English this time, her tone respectful but firm. She told him she had grown up in a neighborhood where language meant connection, where neighbors spoke more than one tongue, where listening was survival. She told him that when her mother lost her job during the recession, scholarships mattered, community mattered, understanding mattered. She did not dramatize her story. She stated it plainly, like fact. Richard studied her expression as if searching for arrogance, for triumph, for anything he could categorize and dismiss. He found none. There was no smirk, no satisfaction, only steadiness. Across the terrace, one of the investors glanced back toward them, observing not as a partner, but as a judge. Reputation traveled faster than numbers. Respect traveled faster than revenue. Richard understood that now in a way he had not understood it 30 minutes earlier. He had built his empire on innovation, on calculated risk, on strategic silence in negotiations. Yet tonight he had underestimated something fundamental. He had mistaken service for lack of education. He had mistaken uniform for limitation. Naomi picked up a fresh bottle of sparkling water and refilled his glass without being asked, the carbonation rising in soft, quiet streams. Her hands did not tremble. Richard watched the bubbles for a second, then looked back at her and said quietly that he had not expected her to understand. Naomi met his gaze and replied that understanding does not always announce itself. It simply exists, waiting for someone to assume it does not. The wind shifted slightly across the rooftop, cool against the warm glow of the lights. In the distance, sirens hummed far below, ordinary city noise, indifferent to billion-dollar negotiations. The investors began returning to the table, their footsteps unhurried but decisive. Richard adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric at his shoulders as if resetting a performance. But something had changed beyond posture. The room no longer belonged to him alone. And as Naomi stepped back into position, silent once more, it was clear that influence had found a new balance, one that could not be undone by money or volume or private language ever again. When the investors resumed their seats, the air felt measured, like a courtroom before a verdict. No one raised their voice. No one mentioned the earlier exchange directly. But the tone had shifted from celebration to scrutiny. The senior investor with the falcon cufflinks folded his hands neatly on the table and addressed Richard in calm, deliberate English. He spoke about partnership, about mutual respect, about the invisible threads that hold international agreements together. His words were polished, diplomatic, yet unmistakably pointed. Richard nodded at the appropriate moments, responding with carefully structured sentences about shared values and long-term growth. He referenced projected returns, expansion into new markets, job creation across 3 states. He spoke the language of confidence again, but it no longer carried the same effortless authority. Every sentence seemed weighed. Every pause felt longer. Naomi moved between chairs with quiet precision, replacing empty glasses, clearing unused plates, her presence steady and unobtrusive. Yet now, every time she approached the table, conversation slowed by a fraction of a second. Not out of dismissal, out of awareness. One of the younger investors turned to her directly and asked, in Arabic, whether she believed cultural understanding truly influenced business outcomes. It was a test, subtle but intentional. Naomi answered thoughtfully, explaining that culture shapes trust, and trust shapes numbers long before contracts are signed. She spoke of how misjudging a single phrase can fracture years of negotiation. She did not speak as a server. She spoke as someone who understood consequence. The skyline behind them shimmered against the dark, the lights of passing boats tracing faint lines across the Hudson River. Richard listened, this time without interruption. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition. He had built companies, scaled technology, commanded rooms filled with venture capitalists. Yet tonight he was witnessing a different kind of leverage, the kind that does not rely on stock value or headlines, the kind rooted in awareness. The senior investor leaned back and exchanged a glance with his colleagues. Then he closed the leather folder in front of him. Not slammed, not abruptly, just closed. He explained that the partnership required further internal discussion before moving forward. The phrasing was polite. The implication was clear. $600 million now rested in uncertainty. Richard inhaled slowly, nodding with controlled composure, though the subtle shift in his posture betrayed the weight of the moment. Naomi refilled a water glass beside him, the faint hiss of carbonation rising between them like quiet punctuation. She did not look at him for validation. She did not look at the investors for approval. She simply completed her task with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. As the investors stood and prepared to leave, the senior partner turned once more toward Naomi and thanked her in Arabic for her insight. The gratitude was genuine. Richard heard it. So did everyone else. And in that final exchange, the balance of the night settled into something undeniable. Money had entered the room first, but respect had decided how it would leave. The rooftop slowly emptied of suits and polished shoes, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne and the echo of decisions not yet finalized. The skyline still glittered as if nothing had shifted, but everyone at that table knew something had. Richard Caldwell remained standing for a moment after the investors disappeared into the private elevator, his reflection caught in the glass wall beside him. 60 stories above Manhattan, he looked exactly as he had an hour earlier. Impeccable suit, perfect posture, billionaire certainty. Yet the silence around him felt different now, heavier, less obedient. Naomi collected the final wine glass from the table, her movements unhurried. She stacked the leather folders neatly to the side as instructed by management, careful not to disturb the embossed edges. The deal papers were still unsigned. Not rejected. Not approved. Suspended. Richard finally turned toward her, the sharp edge in his expression replaced by something more measured. He asked her name. Not the name on the tag. Her full name. Naomi Brooks, she answered evenly. He repeated it once, as if committing it to memory. There was no sarcasm left in his tone. Only calculation, and perhaps something else he was not used to acknowledging. Awareness. The city wind brushed lightly across the terrace, carrying the distant hum of traffic far below. Richard adjusted his cuff, then spoke with a controlled sincerity that felt unfamiliar even to him. He said he may have misjudged the situation earlier. He said negotiations can create tension. He said he had not intended disrespect. Naomi listened without interruption. When he finished, she responded calmly that intention and impact are not always the same thing. The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. She explained that language is powerful because it reveals what people believe is safe to say, especially when they assume no one else understands. Richard exhaled slowly. For the first time that evening, he did not try to reframe the moment. He did not shift blame to humor or culture or misunderstanding. He nodded, not as a gesture of dominance, as acknowledgement. Inside the building, staff began clearing tables from neighboring sections. The jazz music had long since faded into quiet background noise. Naomi gathered her serving tray, preparing to return to the service station. Before she stepped away, Richard spoke again, this time softer. He asked if she had ever considered working in international business. The question lingered between them. Naomi met his eyes steadily and said she had. She had applied once, years ago, to a technology firm downtown. She had been told she was not aligned with the company image. Richard felt the connection before she said the name. Monroe Tech, his primary competitor. The irony did not need explanation. Naomi did not smile. She did not deliver the detail as revenge. She delivered it as fact. The city lights reflected in the glass beside them, twin silhouettes standing in a space where power had quietly rearranged itself. Richard extended his hand, not for a contract, not for a photograph, but for introduction. Naomi looked at it briefly, then shook it firmly. The gesture was brief, professional, balanced. In that moment, no cameras flashed. No applause followed. Yet something far more valuable than $600 million had shifted. He had entered the night believing he controlled the room. He was leaving understanding that respect cannot be negotiated in private language. It must be practiced in everyone. The elevator doors closed behind the last investor, and the rooftop returned to its original illusion of calm. Staff members moved efficiently, clearing crystal glasses and folded linens as if the night had been ordinary. But Richard Caldwell did not leave immediately. He stood near the glass railing overlooking the Hudson River, watching the city lights flicker across the dark water below. 60 stories up, Manhattan looked peaceful, distant, almost forgiving. From this height, consequences did not shout. They whispered. Naomi returned from the service station with a small tablet in her hand, reviewing final charges before closing the section. Her shift was technically over in 20 minutes. Her feet ached inside polished black shoes, the kind chosen for professionalism rather than comfort. She had another early shift in the morning. Life did not pause for billion-dollar negotiations. Richard turned from the skyline and approached her again, slower this time, without the performance that had defined his earlier movements. He asked her how long she had worked at the restaurant. 3 years, she answered. He asked if she enjoyed it. She said she valued the people she met. That answer made him pause. Most people in his world valued scale, leverage, growth percentages. She valued people. The difference lingered in the air between them. Richard admitted quietly that tonight had not unfolded the way he expected. He spoke of preparation, months of strategy calls, private flights between New York and Dubai, spreadsheets projecting revenue across 5 fiscal quarters. He had calculated risk down to decimal points. Yet he had not calculated the cost of assumption. Naomi listened without offering sympathy or judgment. She simply stood, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. She told him that intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it stands beside it. Sometimes it carries the tray. The sentence was not delivered as pride. It was delivered as truth. Richard absorbed it in silence. Across the terrace, the restaurant manager discreetly observed, careful not to intrude. Reputation mattered here as well. Naomi finalized the bill and placed it neatly inside a leather folder. She handed it to Richard with professional courtesy. Their fingers brushed briefly, not by design, but by proximity. Neither pulled away sharply. Neither lingered. The gesture felt balanced, equal. Richard signed the receipt slowly, his signature bold and practiced. Then he looked at her once more and asked if she would consider meeting with him outside of this setting, purely to discuss opportunities. Not as a server. As a professional. Naomi did not answer immediately. She understood the weight behind such offers. Opportunity can empower. It can also entangle. She said she would consider a conversation if it was based on merit and mutual respect. Nothing more. Nothing less. Richard nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. The city wind moved again, lifting the edge of a linen napkin that had been left behind. Naomi caught it before it slipped from the table and smoothed it flat. Control, again, in small movements. As Richard finally stepped toward the elevator, he glanced back at the rooftop that had once felt unquestionably his. Tonight, it had taught him something no boardroom ever had. Influence is not secured by speaking in a language others cannot understand. It is earned when everyone in the room does. The elevator doors slid shut with a muted chime, and for a moment Richard Caldwell stood alone inside the mirrored walls, watching his own reflection descend floor by floor. The city outside the glass tower remained restless, taxis weaving through late-night traffic, headlights streaking like restless thoughts. But inside that elevator, silence pressed closer than the steel walls around him. 60 floors down felt longer than usual. Every word from the rooftop replayed in measured clarity. Not the financial projections. Not the market forecasts. Her sentence. Intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it stands beside it. Sometimes it carries the tray. He adjusted his cuff out of habit, though nothing about his appearance required correction. The doors opened into the private lobby, polished marble reflecting soft recessed lighting. His driver waited near the entrance, car idling curbside. Yet Richard did not step outside immediately. He remained still, phone in hand, staring at the unsigned agreement glowing on his screen. $600 million now paused in uncertainty. Not lost. Not secured. Suspended in evaluation. Upstairs, Naomi removed her apron and folded it carefully into her locker. The fluorescent lights of the staff room hummed overhead, less glamorous than the rooftop, but honest in their brightness. She changed into a simple gray coat, slipped her phone into her pocket, and tied her hair back loosely. Around her, other servers spoke in low tones about tips and late-night subway schedules. No one mentioned the conversation directly, but more than one pair of eyes looked at her with quiet respect. She did not bask in it. She did not shrink from it. She simply gathered her bag and clocked out. When she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool Manhattan air greeted her like a reset. Streetlights cast long reflections on the pavement. A bus passed with a sigh of compressed air. Her shift had ended, but her life remained steady and practical. Rent was due in 12 days. Her younger brother had a college application deadline next month. Language had never been a performance for her. It had been a bridge. Across the street, Richard finally exited the building. For a brief second, their paths aligned again beneath the city lights. He noticed her waiting at the corner for the crosswalk signal to change. No uniform now. No tray. Just a woman in a gray coat standing beneath a street lamp. He hesitated, then walked toward her, not with authority, not with entitlement, but with intention. The traffic light shifted from red to green, casting a faint glow across the intersection. He stopped a respectful distance away and said her name once more. Naomi Brooks. She turned, meeting his gaze calmly. The noise of New York surrounded them. Horns in the distance, footsteps on concrete, the steady pulse of a city that never paused for ego. Richard told her that the investors had already sent a message requesting further discussion. They wanted assurances about cultural alignment. They wanted proof of respect beyond numbers. He admitted that tonight had revealed something he had overlooked. Naomi listened, hands tucked inside her coat pockets, breath visible in the cool air. She said growth is not only measured in revenue. Sometimes it is measured in awareness. The crosswalk countdown ticked softly above them. 7, 6, 5. Richard nodded slowly, understanding that this moment carried more weight than any boardroom applause. When the signal reached 0, Naomi stepped forward across the street, steady and unhurried. Richard remained on the curb for a beat longer, watching as she blended into the rhythm of the city. He had entered the evening believing fluency was power. He was beginning to understand that humility might be greater. Naomi did not look back as she crossed the street, but she felt the weight of the moment lingering behind her like the glow of the traffic light fading from green to red. The city swallowed her quickly, as it does everyone, blending gray coats and hurried footsteps into a single rhythm that did not pause for personal revelations. Richard remained on the curb for several seconds after she disappeared into the flow of pedestrians. The night air felt cooler now, sharper against his face, less forgiving than the climate-controlled rooftop he had left behind. His phone vibrated in his hand. A message from the senior investor. A short line. "We need to revisit tone before numbers." That was all. No exclamation. No anger. Just clarity. Inside the black sedan waiting at the curb, the leather seats smelled faintly of polish and quiet expectation. His driver asked softly where to. Richard answered automatically, the address of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, yet his voice carried less certainty than usual. As the car merged into traffic, he watched the city through tinted glass. Construction cranes lit against the skyline. Late-night diners glowing under fluorescent lights. People who would never sit at his boardroom table, yet who moved through the same streets with equal gravity. Upstairs in a modest apartment 20 blocks south, Naomi unlocked her door and stepped into a space that felt small but steady. A single lamp illuminated the living room. A stack of textbooks rested on the coffee table beside a worn but carefully maintained laptop. Her younger brother's acceptance letters were pinned to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like state outlines. She placed her bag on the chair and exhaled slowly, not in exhaustion, but in reflection. Tonight had not changed who she was. It had simply revealed it to someone else. Her phone buzzed once. A notification from the restaurant manager thanking her for maintaining professionalism under pressure. She typed back a brief response, polite and measured. No embellishment. No retelling. Meanwhile, Richard stared at his own reflection in the darkened car window. For years he had believed fluency in markets was enough. That mastering metrics and timing guaranteed influence. But the memory that returned to him was not of revenue charts. It was of Naomi standing calm beneath the chandelier light, correcting him without raising her voice. The car slowed at a red light near Times Square, giant digital billboards flashing advertisements worth millions of dollars per minute. Richard watched the screens flicker, then imagined the investors reviewing their notes, weighing more than profit margins. Respect had entered the conversation, and once it enters, it does not quietly exit. Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, opening her laptop to review a translation request from a community center scheduled for the weekend. Arabic to English, English to Arabic. She moved between the languages effortlessly, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. Outside her window, a siren passed in the distance, then faded. Inside the black sedan, the traffic light turned green again, and the city resumed its steady pulse. Richard leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes briefly. $600 million still hung in negotiation. Yet for the first time in a long while, he was thinking about something beyond the contract. He was thinking about alignment, about humility, about the cost of assumption. And somewhere between 42nd Street and Central Park, he began to understand that growth is not only measured in quarterly earnings. Sometimes it is measured in the moments that force a man to listen. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Richard Caldwell's penthouse, casting pale gold lines across polished hardwood floors and framed magazine covers that celebrated his rise to the top. Headlines spoke of innovation, disruption, dominance. None of them mentioned humility. He stood at his kitchen counter with a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hand, rereading the overnight email from the senior investor. The message was brief but decisive. The partnership would continue only if there was visible commitment to cultural intelligence and leadership maturity. Not a public apology, not a press release, a shift in conduct. Meanwhile, 20 blocks south, Naomi Brooks sat at her small kitchen table with a mug of store-brand tea, reviewing notes for a weekend translation workshop at the community center. Morning light touched the acceptance letters on the refrigerator, each one a reminder of why she kept moving forward. Her phone vibrated softly. An unfamiliar number. She let it ring once more before answering. Richard's voice carried through the line, steady, measured, stripped of the sharp edges from the night before. He asked if she would be willing to meet him later that afternoon, not in a restaurant, not on a rooftop, but in his office conference room. He explained that the investors wanted assurance. He needed insight. Naomi listened without interruption. Outside her window, a delivery truck idled, and somewhere down the block a child laughed on the way to school. Ordinary sounds. Real sounds. She told him she would meet, on one condition. The conversation would be about systems, not just one moment. About hiring practices. About training. About what respect looks like when no one is watching. There was a pause on the line, long enough to measure sincerity. Richard agreed. No negotiation. No performance. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Caldwell Technologies headquarters, illuminating a sleek conference room where quarterly forecasts were usually debated. When Naomi stepped inside, she wore a simple navy blazer instead of a server's apron. No uniform. No tray. Just quiet confidence. Several executives sat at the table, notebooks open. Richard stood at the head, not speaking first this time. He gestured for her to begin. And as she outlined practical steps for cross-cultural communication, bias training, and inclusive leadership, the room listened. Not because of charity, not because of spectacle, but because clarity commands attention. $600 million still rested in negotiation. Yet something else was taking shape inside that glass room. A recalibration. A reminder that language reveals belief. And belief shapes legacy. The conference room remained quiet even after Naomi finished outlining her final recommendation. Sunlight reflected off the glass walls, casting sharp lines across the long walnut table where executives usually debated margins and market share. Today, no one interrupted. No one checked their phone. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly against the chair in front of him, absorbing not only her words but the reaction of his leadership team. A few executives exchanged thoughtful glances. One began taking more detailed notes. Another leaned forward, elbows on the table, listening in a way that signaled recalibration rather than resistance. Naomi did not oversell her ideas. She spoke about measurable policy changes, structured cultural training, hiring audits reviewed quarterly instead of annually, transparent accountability systems that applied to every level of leadership, including the executive suite. She explained that respect cannot be reactive. It must be embedded. Richard finally spoke, but not to counter. He acknowledged that growth without awareness is fragile. He admitted that leadership is tested most clearly in unscripted moments. The room registered the shift. Not dramatic, not theatrical, subtle, but unmistakable. A senior vice president asked Naomi how such initiatives could influence international negotiations. She answered plainly. That trust accelerates agreement, while arrogance delays it. In global markets, perception travels faster than press releases. Silence followed again, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. Richard glanced toward the city skyline visible beyond the glass, remembering the rooftop and the single sentence that had changed the tone of an entire evening. He turned back to his team and instructed them to begin drafting an implementation plan immediately, not as a public relations gesture. As internal reform. Naomi gathered her folders slowly, preparing to leave once the discussion transitioned into logistics. Richard stopped her gently and asked whether she would consider consulting during the rollout phase. Not as a favor, as a contracted advisor. The offer was structured, professional, clear. Naomi met his gaze and said she would review the proposal. Her voice carried the same calm confidence it had the night before. No triumph. No hesitation. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through open workspaces unaware that a subtle but meaningful shift had taken place above them. $600 million still awaited final confirmation. But inside that room, something more durable had begun to form. A standard. A recognition that power is not proven by who you can silence, but by who you are willing to hear. By the end of the week, the ripple had become visible. Caldwell Technologies released a concise internal memo outlining new leadership standards, cross-cultural training requirements, and measurable accountability metrics. There were no dramatic headlines, no public spectacle, just structure, clear language, transparent expectations. Inside the executive floor, conversations shifted from damage control to deliberate improvement. Richard Caldwell reviewed each draft personally, removing vague phrasing and replacing it with direct commitments. Words mattered now in ways he had once underestimated. Across town, Naomi Brooks sat in a modest conference room at the community center, leading a small group through translation exercises. Whiteboard markers in hand, she moved between English and Arabic with fluid ease, encouraging participants to consider context, tone, and intention. She spoke about how language shapes perception long before it shapes contracts. Her students listened closely, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the rhythm of understanding. Her phone remained on silent inside her bag, where an official consulting agreement from Caldwell Technologies waited for review. Later that afternoon, Richard received another message from the senior investor. This one longer. The board had reviewed the internal policy changes. They appreciated the swift implementation. They requested a follow-up meeting to resume negotiations. Not because of profit projections alone, because of demonstrated alignment. Richard read the message twice, then allowed himself a slow exhale. $600 million no longer felt suspended in tension. It felt conditional upon integrity. He leaned back in his office chair and glanced through the glass wall at employees moving through open workstations. Innovation was happening as it always had, but now there was an added awareness beneath it. A recalibration of culture. That evening, Naomi reviewed the consulting contract at her kitchen table, reading each clause carefully. Compensation was fair. Scope was defined. Autonomy was respected. She signed her name with steady confidence and emailed the document back without flourish. Not as a favor, as a professional agreement. In separate parts of the city, two individuals who had begun the week on opposite sides of a table prepared for the next stage of partnership. One had learned that power without respect is fragile. The other had proven that dignity does not require volume to be heard. And somewhere between policy drafts and translation notes, a different kind of success had taken shape, one built not on assumption, but on understanding. The follow-up meeting took place on a clear Monday morning, sunlight pouring through the glass walls of Caldwell Technologies headquarters as if the city itself wanted transparency. The senior investors appeared on a large screen at the end of the conference room, their expressions measured but no longer guarded. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the table once more, yet his posture carried a different energy. Not dominance. Deliberation. Beside him sat Naomi Brooks, no apron, no name tag, only a structured blazer and a leather folder containing the finalized cultural framework now being implemented company-wide. When the call began, Richard did not lead with revenue forecasts. He began with acknowledgement. He outlined the policy changes, the mandatory training sessions, the revised leadership standards tied directly to executive performance reviews. He spoke clearly, without embellishment, without defensiveness. Then he gestured to Naomi. She explained how language shapes negotiation, how respect is not symbolic but strategic, how misalignment at the smallest level can fracture partnerships at the highest level. Her voice was steady, composed, precise. The investors listened closely. One nodded slowly. Another asked detailed questions about measurable outcomes. Naomi answered each with data and clarity, referencing timelines, feedback mechanisms, and third-party audits. There was no tension in the room, only evaluation. When the discussion concluded, the senior investor with the falcon cufflinks spoke last. He said partnership is not built on perfection, but on response. He acknowledged the visible correction and the sincerity behind it. Then he confirmed that negotiations would proceed toward finalization. $600 million, once suspended in silence, began moving forward again. The screen went dark. The conference room remained quiet for a moment longer. Richard exhaled slowly, not in relief alone, but in recognition. He turned to Naomi and thanked her, not for saving a deal, but for revealing a blind spot. Naomi gathered her folder, offering a small, professional nod. She reminded him that awareness is ongoing work, not a single correction. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through hallways unaware that a lesson in humility had just shaped their company's future. Weeks later, when the agreement was officially signed, there were no rooftop jokes, no private languages used as shields, only measured respect across the table. And somewhere in Manhattan, beneath the steady pulse of the city, two truths remained clear. Money can secure attention. Power can command a room. But only respect can sustain it.